Pastor Eric here. This is the third in our series of videos that we've been recording talking about where we as a church feel called to grow in effective ministry. I am going to ask you, first of all, to turn to Acts chapter 1. Turn to Acts chapter 1. And as you do that, I want to talk a little bit about the place that we find ourselves. So within people who study missions and world Christianity, it's common to talk about this cycle that you see happen in different places, and it's a cycle of how Christianity relates to and is known within the context of the broader culture. So they would say, first of all, you have places that are pre-Christian, meaning that Christianity and its influence and people's knowledge and familiarity with Christianity are not widespread. In pre-Christian societies, which we can see in different times and places, including in our world today, there are places where people have never met a Christian, never heard a presentation of the gospel. In pre-Christian societies, there's a kind of openness and interest, and what we need in order for the gospel to spread in those places is missionary activity, for Christians to move into those places in a way that bears witness to Jesus Christ, because absent that, people are not going to know about Jesus, and so it requires a sort of going. Over time, as Christianity spreads, you see it getting more and more woven into the fabric of society, and more people, even if they're not becoming Christians, at least becoming familiar with Christianity. And you arrive ultimately at a place that people that study it call Christendom. And within Christendom, the idea is not that, again, that everyone's a believer, even that the majority of people are true believers, but that Christianity has spread to such an extent that it is widely known, that it is influential, and that it is deeply connected with the surrounding culture. And within Christendom, the important thing to understand is that oftentimes the mission functionally changes, and the model for mission ceases to be kind of going out and seeking out and witnessing to people. And instead it relies on the church to stand as a witness to the gospel and Christianity. Because people outside of the church, even if they aren't familiar deeply with Christianity, even if they haven't believed it for themselves, they're naturally going to kind of come to the church to answer their spiritual questions. If they're wrestling with doubts or struggles, they'll look to the church and the leadership of the church often to answer those struggles. But Christendom also, these cycles take place over centuries, but over time often becomes compromised. And the church starts to lose the gospel, lose its distinctiveness, because it makes compromises with worldly powers in order to stay respectable or influential. And what results from that is often a decline of Christianity in those places. And so you see those societies become post-Christian. They think that they've kind of heard what Christianity has to offer, and they aren't interested, even though oftentimes they've never really been exposed to biblical Christianity. But you have this disinterest, and then the idea is eventually, when a society is post-Christian enough, it functionally is pre-Christian, and then you'll often see a renewal of movement and of the gospel coming back to that place. There are places in the world, when you look at the last 2,000 years of history, that more than once have seen Christianity come and seen fruit, and then seen decline, and then grown back in terms of coming to know and learn about Jesus again. But the thing to understand about post-Christian societies is that the call to mission has to shift more towards that missionary posture. And indeed, part of why the church tends to decline in those societies is because we still think that people are going to come to the church to answer their spiritual questions, when in fact they're not going to, and we're not going to them anymore with the gospel. I lay that out as a starting place because I want to suggest this. We as a country, depending on where you live in the country, are somewhere between Christendom and being post-Christian. There are places like New York City that are pretty clearly post-Christian. There are places like parts of the rural South that are probably still functionally Christendom. But in a place like Omaha, we are very much in between. And as part of a broader culture, we're moving to a place that is probably majority post-Christian. That most people that you will meet, while they know about Christianity, they're wholly disinterested in it. They think they know enough to kind of not care about it. And it would not cross their mind for example, to get up on a Sunday morning and go to church, or to have a conversation with somebody about Jesus. And the problem with that is that if we don't recognize and live into that, the churches in Omaha are really just going to keep slicing up a smaller and smaller pie of people that are still functioning within Christendom. And the good news is not going to go out. And so what we need is to have an awareness of the state of the world that we live in. And out of that, a rededicated commitment personally to the mission of God. Read with me Acts chapter 1, verse 8. Jesus is here. Last week, we read the Great Commission from Matthew, and this is the Great Commission in Acts. Each of the authors chooses to record different parts of the mission that Jesus gives to the church. But Jesus says this in Acts chapter 1. He says, "But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth. So here's the question that you need to ask yourself. How, in your mind, did the early church grow? How did it grow? I think our instinct is to assume that it grew through great individual evangelists, especially the apostles. We think about Peter at Pentecost in Acts 2, preaching this sermon and thousands of people become believers. We think about Paul and his missionary journeys going to these different cities to proclaim the good news and build up the church. And unquestionably, there were certain people set apart to the calling of evangelist that had a deep impact on the growth of the early church. But we also know, both from the New Testament and the church and from church history, that it's not as simple as that. Indeed, one of the interesting things in some of Paul's letters, like Romans, is that we find him writing to churches that are vibrant and growing and living out their Christian faith that no apostle started. What seems to have happened, for example, in Rome is that some believers, maybe even on Pentecost, heard about Christianity there and became Christians, and then went back to Rome or moved to Rome, which was this central urban cosmopolitan hub of the Roman Empire. And they started churches there, and they shared Jesus with their neighbors. They bore witness in Rome. And as a result of that, the church was born. And indeed, we recognize that the church continued to be built up and grow even without the apostles' influences. I mean, when Paul left a city like Corinth, there was maybe a few hundred believers, and over a century or two, it grows to this church of hundreds of thousands of Christians, probably tens of thousands at least of Christians. And that did not happen because there was one or two men that came and gave the gospel to all those people. That happened through all of the believers in the early church adopting what we might call a missionary posture towards the world in their daily lives. A missionary posture towards the world in their daily lives. Here's what I mean. Central to the New Testament idea of the spread of the gospel is us bearing witness. The idea is that as we move into the world naturally, when Jesus talks about being in Jerusalem and then in Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth, while certain people were called because of that, like Paul, to go on these missionary journeys, the norm was that people would simply live their lives and they would move to different places, they would travel between different cities, and as they went about that life, they bore witness in Jerusalem first, which is where the church started, and then in Judea and Samaria, the surrounding areas, and then as it continues to spread out, and as those millions of individuals continue to bear witness to this day, it spreads to the end of the world. And the key thing to recognize about that missionary posture is that that is not something that specifically applies to a few professionals or to a few foreign missionaries. Certain people have that calling, and that is great. But that is a posture that we are actually being called to engage with as Christians ourselves, that every believer is being called as they move through the world in the places that they are placed by God to bear that kind of witness. So what does that mean for us? Well, first of all, it means that we need to adopt that missionary posture in our own lives. That we need to see our personal lives, our networks of relationships, and the places that God has placed each of us as a missions field where we are intentionally going to be cultivating relationships and bearing witness about Jesus. And I just want to name something for you as I say that. I think that one of the issues is that, for us, is that really that's always how Christianity is supposed to work. Each of us is given this task, right? This isn't just for like the apostles or a few pastors or something. But because of Christendom, a lot of us as Christians were let off the hook from having to do that. We should have still been doing it, but because within Christendom, plenty of people would naturally come to the church and naturally have questions about Jesus, it kind of worked, imperfectly, but it worked. But now, our failure is really being exposed to do that. And so we need to really, in a much more immediate way, just name that like, that was always a failure, but especially now in this moment, in this cultural place, what we need to be doing is each of us need to be taking ownership for our calling to take Jesus to the places that he has put us, rather than to expect people to come to us or to our churches to find out about him. This means that people are first and foremost often going to encounter Jesus in you. That does not necessarily mean that you as a lone individual are going to lead someone all the way through the process of coming to know Jesus and becoming a disciple, but that oftentimes the first person that they will meet who's really engaged with their faith might be you, or at least the first person they have a relationship with will be you as you build a relationship with them. And through that, then, they are drawn into connection with the church and the community of faith. And through that, they hear the gospel, maybe through you, maybe through those other connections, maybe through the church. And they are drawn then into Christianity and following after Jesus. But the thing to recognize is that you are the relational touch point. You are the point of initiation that begins that connection they have to the church and to Jesus. And if you're not moving into the world around you in that way, they're never going to have that point of connection. All right. If that's true, then what in practice does that look like? What are some things that we can do to have that missionary posture in our lives? Well, first of all missionaries think in terms of their mission field. If they're sent to a specific city or sent to a specific country, they think first about that city and country as their mission field. And then what missionaries are trained to do is to hone that down, to have a clearer and clearer sense of what specifically their mission field is. These are my neighbors. This is the place where I live. These are the people that God has put me in relationship with. And this is the place then that I'm going to start sharing the gospel and trying to build up the church in this place. And so each of us is called to look at our lives, I think, and ask that same question. What is my mission field? First of all, and I think this is really important as a starting place, the first mission field you have, if you have parents or siblings or children or a spouse, is to say that part of the answer to that is your family. In many ways, especially if you have like a bunch of young kids, one of the main ways you're going to be developing your mission field is by investing in your kids and sharing the gospel with them, because God has given you these people in your home that don't come into the world knowing Jesus, that don't come into the world as developed disciples, and you can start helping to grow and develop them. Beyond that, though, because while that is a good and core part of it, it's not all that we're called to. We should also be looking at our neighborhood. I have a friend that talks about the hashtag approach to your neighborhood, by which he means if you picture a hashtag with those 9 squares, you put your house in the middle, you think about the 8 houses that would be around your house, and you say, do I know the people that live in those houses? Am I trying to build a relationship with them? And obviously it can happen in other spheres too. For example, I've used our bus stop to try to get to know some of the families in the surrounding houses in my neighborhood as I've moved here. But we're supposed to look around our neighborhood and say, this is my mission field. So what does it look like to really develop that as a mission field, to start to meet people and build relationships? And you can think about that in other places, your workplace, for example, or if there is a hobby or activity that you enjoy doing. Look around that place and say, how can I develop that as a mission field? But you might still be wondering, okay, but what does that mean to develop it? And I'm not going to give you a full program. That's more than we have time for in this video. But let me give you a couple of suggestions. First of all, and this is really the first step to that process, after you just get to know and kind of name the fact that these people are the place that Jesus is calling you to bear witness, is to start praying intentionally for those people. Pray for God to work in their hearts to draw them to himself. Pray for opportunities to talk with them about Jesus. Pray regularly and pray in a way that expects and has your eyes open, looking for ways that God is answering those prayers and giving you opportunities. Second, practice missionary hospitality. Missionary hospitality. One of the greatest resources that Jesus has given you to build relationships and bear witness to him in the world is your house. It's your table, especially. Even in a culture that has become disconnected in a lot of ways, there is still a real power to inviting someone over to share a meal, or to come sit on your front porch with you and watch the kids play, or to watch a game at your house, to host and welcome people over. Our houses are meant to be missionary outposts for the kingdom of heaven, and so we should be thinking about ways to show hospitality to people around us. And then one other way is by asking intentionally spiritual questions about what the people that you know think. Asking someone a spiritual question is not the destination of sharing the gospel with them, but oftentimes it is the first step on that process. What do I mean by spiritual questions? Well, the best thing to do is to simply ask people's opinion about something. Ask them what they think of the church. Ask them what they think about Jesus. Ask them what they think about the Bible. Ask them what they think about some issue connected with spirituality in our world today. And then really listen and try to understand. Ultimately, you can share your view, but the best thing to do first is to ask the question and listen, and then ask a follow-up question and another follow-up question. And in that conversation, you're not trying to engineer a gospel presentation. You're simply trying to begin to engage with matters that matter, with spiritual things with those people. And as you do that, you'll begin to then find opportunities to bear witness. Again, I could say a lot more about all of that, but here's the core thing I want you to understand. While all of those tools and strategies and all of that are useful, the most important question is simply whether you, as an individual, are going to engage with the mission of God. And the thing I want you to hear as I wrap this up is that as you do that, there is real power. I had a friend who told me about, he was a pastor, and he stepped in to this pulpit of this kind of dying rural church. And for a year or two, he kind of preached, and it was, mostly elderly people. They weren't reaching anyone in the community. And most of the people in the church had kind of the Christendom mentality that, well, we just do our thing and people will come to us, and people weren't coming. But there was one woman, older woman, I think like 60s or 70s in the church. She was single, and she, as this friend started to talk about the mission of God, had the sense that, you know what, this is our job, this is my job to bear witness to Jesus, and for her specifically to help build up this church that she'd been a part of her whole life. And so for the first time in her life, she started doing that. And my friend will say that his church now has been revitalized, and it's like 4 times the size it was when he started going there, which is good because it was very small. But he would say that in many ways it was this woman who single-handedly caused that to happen by engaging with the mission of God. Not that every single person came, but she started asking everyone she knew to come to church, and she started a Bible study with some women in the neighborhood, and she started learning about how to share the gospel with people. And by his estimate, 30 or 40 people just from her got engaged with their faith again. Some of them came to know Jesus for the first time. Others were drawn into the fellowship of the church. And then through those people being drawn in and seeing that example, they also started sharing Jesus with others. And here's the thing. Maybe, but probably not, will you be the person through whom God brings 30 or 40 people to know him. But you might be the person through whom God is working to bring 3 or 4 over the course of some years of faithful sharing and witnessing. We have a real power because we have God's Holy Spirit in us, and we have the gospel that changes lives to go into the world and bear powerful witness. What we need is the mindset to remind ourselves that that's what it means to follow Jesus. So I want to just invite you now, as you sit down and talk with your life group, to be talking about how can I as an individual and how can we as a group of people together be encouraging each other and building each other up in pursuing the mission of God.